So we're going to start the day off by having some definitions, because it's good for us all to be in the same place in terms of understanding what this over 80 thing is. And we've asked Ray Davis to give that talk. Ray is, I'm going to get his title right, is the Old Growth and Spotted Owl Monitoring Lead for the Forest Service and the BLM. So in terms of where, what, why, how kind of stuff having to do with late successional and old growth, he's the guy that's got all the numbers. So help me welcome Ray Davis.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. As my job title indicates, I'm the guy who's responsible for keeping track of what's happening to the old forests within the Northwest Forest Plan area since the implementation of the Northwest Forest Plan back in 1994. So I'm going to talk about defining older forests. To keep track of older forests, you have to come up with a definition, so you can track that definition through time, through plot data, or by mapping it. And so I'm going to start with over 80 years, which does not actually, it's almost as long as we've been trying to define older forests, but it refers to the age where we consider in this region forests are no longer younger. They're starting to become mature. We call it late successional, and then when they really age, they get into the old growth category. So some history on the definitions. In the early 1900s, there was relative terms used like old growth, large second growth. These terms basically differentiated the slower growing older forest from the faster growing younger forest. In a general sense, they were related to the diameter of the dominant, codominant trees. 1980s was actually the decade where a lot of very smart people got together and started trying to wrap their heads around how to define this thing called old growth. There's a task force put together. Everybody agreed that old growth is best perceived as a stage of forest development characterized by more diversity of structure and function than that found in younger successional stages. At the end of that decade, Dale Robertson, the chief of the Forest Service, sent out a memo to the regional foresters, station directors that had a generic definition attached to it and a policy statement for the Forest Service, and basically said old growth is usually distinguished by the presence of larger, older trees, structural attributes such as multiple canopy layers, decadence in the form of standing dead trees, which we call snags, and accumulations of fallen trees or downwood. Shortly after that, 92, 93, interim definitions came out. In the 80s, they realized that one definition was going to cut it for all the different types of forests within the region. So these interim definitions differed by forest types from Douglas fir to western hemlock, silver fir, and so on. And they were discrete classifications based on minimum amounts of old growth elements such as snags and logs, and they were related to a stand age. Old growth began about 150 to 240 years of age, depending on the forest type. Then in 1993, FEMAT, Northwest Forest Plan, this is the year where the magical 80 years seemed to come forth, and it was described as the age at which stand development starts to mature, and the key word is around 80 years. The maturation stage, 80 to 140, and then the transition stage, usually where the mature forests start to transition into an old growth condition, begins anywhere between 150 to 250 years of age. More recently, age is being used to describe old forests. Franklin and Johnson, in a recent ecological forestry paper, used three ages: 80, 120, 160, that might be declared as old forests, and they stated that these ages are commonly used in part of the social dialogue and are intensely debated. Most recently, with the BLM Western Oregon Plan Revision, they use the term older or mature and more structurally complex multi-layered conifer forests, and the ages they put out range from 80 to 120, 140, 160, and 200 years of age. So from a monitoring standpoint, our definition has actually never really used age. This document that came out by Hemstrom and others in 1998, 1998, acknowledged that the definitions that we were going to start to use for monitoring old forests were basically black and white answers to this real world condition where structure and composition of older forests differs in gradients. And the same document made a recommendation that we needed to refine the definitions or perhaps use indices to assign plots and remotely sensed stands to a position along a continuum of older forest structure and composition. Our old definition is represented in this illustration right here. There's basically two parts to it. If the average stand diameter was greater than 20 inches and the canopy cover was greater than 10%, then we tallied it as a late successional old forest. And that's what we've been doing for the 10-year report and 15-year report. Now, the 20-year report will be released next week. This report, we analyzed old growth across the Northwest Forest Plan area using this definition, but we also are using a new monitoring definition represented by old growth forest structure elements such as the density of large live trees, snags, downwood, and diameter diversity. Now, new is in quotations here because this is really not a new definition. It's based on almost a 30-year-old concept developed by Tom Spees and Jerry Franklin back in 1988 called the Old Growth Structure Index. And this graphic sort of represents how this index works. Can you see my cursor? Okay. So Old Growth Index is on the y-axis, stand age from younger to older on the x-axis. So as this graphic shows two different successional trajectories where you have an old forest and there's some sort of stand replacement disturbance and leaving a lot of snags and downwood. And then it starts to develop into an older forest with time. So that OGSI, the snags and the downwood elements would contribute to that score. Then it starts to deplete, and as it ages, it starts to increase again. A successional development after, let's say, a clear cut would follow along this path right here where you don't have a lot of snags and downwood, and then you basically, it's all live trees, and then you start getting your snags and downwoods over here. So I call this kind of going back to the basics in terms of the basic elements of old growth. And I'm going to break it apart by individual elements. So let's start with large trees. This graphic right here shows that blue line represents a score that you're going to get for the large tree element based on the density of large trees. We use representative plot data from old stands, and so on this axis right here, as the density increases in terms of the large trees, your score will follow this trajectory right here, so that by the time you have a high density, you're getting a live element score of 100. Now that applies for all the other elements, such as large snags. So in this scenario right here, your score might follow that trajectory. For fallen trees, it might look something like this. And then for multiple canopy layers, which we measure using a diameter diversity index, it might follow something like this. Now the OGSI adds those together, and the average of those, of that sum, is basically the index. So that index shows you the full continuum, the spectrum of forest development from young to old. But from a monitoring standpoint, we have to tell you how many acres of old forest do we have at time 1 or 1993, and how many acres do we have at time 2, in this case 2012. That's 20 years. So we are forced to pick a threshold. And what we did was we used the 80 years as our first threshold. So what you do is you look at your plot data between your OGSI scores and your stand age. You intersect that line at 80 and you go across. And so this represents your OGSI threshold for mapping forests that represent this broader spectrum right here. Includes the mature to old growth spectrum. Likewise, we picked 200, which is kind of a common age that represents when you start getting into the old growth condition. Early old growth, perhaps, I've heard it called. And you go up and you intersect, and so your mapping threshold is a higher OGSI score, and that represents the right side of the spectrum right here. So that's basically what we're doing in the 20-year report, is we're going to report acres based on both of those thresholds. Now, the definition is reflected in how many acres you have. So a more inclusive definition, such as the OGSI 80, you're going to have more acres. And so as of 1993, we had somewhere between 12 and 13 million acres on federal lands in the Northwest Forest Plan area. If we go to the less inclusive OGSI 200, we're down to 6 million acres. 120 right here, 160 right here. FEMA's estimate of how many acres we had at the time that they were doing that analysis falls in between that. So we felt we framed what we had out there fairly well. So in the past, we've had one definition that basically covered all 50 million acres of the Northwest Forest Plan area, and this time we actually created and customized that OGSI equation for all the different forest types or broad forest zones within the Northwest Forest Plan area. So every color on this map right here, which reflects different types of forest, western hemlock, redwoods, ponderosa pine, has a different equation. And I'm going to, as an example, just go over the western hemlock forest type, which takes up about 30% of the forest within the Northwest Forest Plan area. So this is the actual scatter graph of the OGSI plots, of the plot data for OGSI against stand age for western hemlock plots. And you can see at 80 we come across, so at the OGSI 80 threshold for mapping and tracking and monitoring would be about 24. For 200, it's going to be about 44. You'll notice that there are stands below 80 years of age that are younger that actually have pretty high OGSI scores. They could be post-disturbance, or maybe they have a high component of dead wood, live diameter diversity. So this kind of illustrates this dilemma with picking an age. You can see from this scatter graph that depending on a whole host of conditions, site conditions, disturbance histories, you're going to get some noise in this distribution. And likewise, we have plots that are older than 80 that have very low OGSIs. Those might be in very harsh conditions, poor sites. So nothing's perfect, and we'll be tweaking this forever probably. Here's another way of looking at it. So over here we got OGSI. This is a percentile graph. So it's kind of like box whisker graph, except it's lines. And you've got stand age here from 0 to 320. So this dashed line represents your 5th percentile, this one the 95th percentile. Here's your inner quartiles, and your median is the dark bold line right here. So you can see as the stand age increases, your OGSI increases, such that at 80, it's the inner quartiles are from 10 to 30. At 200, it's about 30 to 55. All right. I'm going to look at what the components now in the plot data that make up the OGSI. So this is the same, this is western hemlock again. This is your OGSI cumulative score. But now we have different colors representing the 4 elements in it. So you can see that early on, there's not a lot of live tree score until you get to about 80 years of age. Drier forest type would look like that. Grand fir, white fir. I'll go back and forth. Perhaps a better way to look at this is look at the proportion of the OGSI score by those forest types. So western hemlock, we see that spike of post-disturbance snags and down wood, and a little bit of live tree diversity here, diameter diversity. You really don't get to where these 4 components are making up more or less equivalent proportions of the index till about age 200, 220. Whereas in white fir, you're starting to see that at a younger age, maybe 140, 150, and maybe a higher component of dead wood contributes to that OGSI. So that's the guts of it. I thought I'd show you some maps of it. This is a picture from 1993 from the satellites of the southern portion or the central portion of the Coast Range in Oregon. Here's the Willamette Valley. Here's the Umpqua Valley. I put a fire that burnt in 1966, a big coast fire. This was called the Oxbow burn. It was burnt pretty high, and then it was salvaged. So By the time this satellite took this picture, it was almost 30 years of age. So brown right here represents a low OGSI score. Dark green represents a very high score. Over here you can see the Siuslaw National Forest. This is the Elliott State Forest. And over here is the Umpqua National Forest. We have some Roseburg and Eugene BLM parcels in between. So now I'm going to jump ahead 20 years. And I'm going to go back and forth, let you kind of see the differences. So that's 2012. That's 1993 again. And go back to 2012. You're starting to see things get a little bit lighter. When within the fire, the OGSI is starting to increase. What really pops out to me is this checkerboard pattern on the BLM land, the ONC lands. You're really starting to see that pattern very broadly. If you look really closely here on the Siuslaw, this is one of the forests that we noticed that it's starting to actually get some darker greens in there, and that's because of the fire history. There were some big fires there back in the middle of the 1800s. What I like about these maps is it's not black and white. It shows you the full spectrum and gives you a lot more information than just, yes, it's old growth, no, it's not old growth or old forest. And it also allows you to look at the amount of older forest or the entire forest spectrum for 2 points of time. So here is the frequency distribution of OGSI for non-federal lands. You can see there's a very high amount of non-federal lands with very low OGSI scores. This is 10 equal breaks, 0 to 10, 10 to 20, and so forth. And it's kind of skewed to the left. And here's what it looked like in 1993, 2012. I apologize, there's a lot of information on this, but if you notice, BLM is a little bit more skewed to the center, Forest Service even a little bit more skewed to the center, and then you get to the parks, and it's skewed over to the right-hand side. So, that's kind of a neat way to look at the entire spectrum of forest conditions on the federal lands, or on all lands, actually. So that's pretty much all I got. We just want to acknowledge co-authors on the 20-year report listed up on top, and it was a team effort. There was a lot of help that was contributed by several people to come up with developing or implementing the concept of the OGSI in a monitoring context. We had several meetings culminated in a pizza party. We got it done. And I hope it makes sense. So with that, I think I have time for a couple questions.
Great.
Yes.
Have you talked much about any differences in stand origin in terms of OGSI score? Because back when we were talking about this originally, there were very few plantations over 80. We're starting to have plantations over 80, and do they differ in fundamental ways from stands of natural origin in terms of their OGSI score?
Well, I guess when I think of natural origin,
Can you repeat the question?
Oh, I'm sorry. The question was, does the OGSI differ in 80-year-old plantations as opposed to an 80-year-old natural regenerated stand? So in this context, I'm going to assume the natural regeneration was due to some stand replacement disturbance. So what you're going to see is there will be some remnants of those relic dead trees and down wood still within the stand, and maybe some surviving large trees within the stand at 80, whereas in a plantation, it's mostly going to be, your OGSI score is mostly going to be constituted from the live tree element. You're going to start to get some mortality and some snags down wood, but we're looking at the large diameter stuff, not the small stuff. So I suspect it will have a lower OGSI score as compared to the natural stand. We haven't actually broke it apart and looked at it in those terms yet.
I'm curious not only in terms of the legacy, but in terms of the development of the trees in the plantation, which tend to be more fully stocked and less open grown, more uniform in species and trajectory.
Well, if it hasn't been thinned, they're probably going to be, and it's a productive site, they'll probably be plugging along but not getting very big. as opposed to a natural stand where maybe there's more space in between the live trees. And there's definitely going to be some differences, but we haven't taken the time to actually parse those apart and look at it, but we have the data to do that now. One more question? Yes?
Is it possible then to have a high OGSI score with no live trees then?
The question was, is it possible to have a high OGSI with no live trees? I guess I'll go back to a graphic to answer that question. So this right here, I guess it depends on where you draw your threshold and what you consider a high OGSI. In terms of our monitoring, when we first started doing this, we picked the 80-year-old threshold. So let me see if I can go to that. There you go. So we picked the 80-year-old threshold, and we realized, oh, wait a second, we got some young forests post-fire stand replacement that are getting some high OGSIs. We don't want to tally those as old forest acres in our old forest monitoring. So what we had to do, so I guess the answer at OGSI 80 is yes. What we had to do is we had to adjust the query so that we we only included plots and stands that had greater than 10% conifer cover or canopy cover, and also had at least one live tree that was the diameter of what we call the large tree, or had an average stand diameter that was half that diameter. So we had to compensate for that when we went down to the OGSI 80 threshold. But you're never going to get, you're only going to get 2 components of that 4-component element, so you can only get maybe a 50 out of 100. All right, thanks.
Thank you.